once again, the Outcast Intellectual Podcast, an episode begins, this time with the drastically handsome, rugged, and bow hunting Matty, also known as Matthias Sterner. I'm generally, like a big, I'm not going to say animal lover is just such a cheesy thing to say, I guess, but it's like, I have a very particular attitude towards animals and hunting and stuff like that. But I've also never known someone who hunts who is actually intellectual about it and has that perspective. And I just figured, it'd be cool to have a talk about it because, there's how I feel about it and then there's what I think about it, even without, us talking about it. And the thing that's interesting, I think the thing that interested me the most to begin with is that you actually hunt with a bow and arrow. It's not like a rifle with a scope or anything like that. So I guess it's probably the best place to start. I mean, I could do an intro, but people are here for the discussion, so people know you're awesome already. Otherwise, you wouldn't be on the podcast. So yeah, what got you into hunting, and also what made you decide to use a bow and arrow versus going, at it from another angle, or is it?
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
So I think I actually want to start off by saying I am an animal lover. I'm on the exact same path and page as you in that regard. My dad was a vet growing up, so he had his own veterinary surgery where we would be able to take animals home at the nighttime if they were that sick, and we always had to look after them. I've always had animals, we've had dogs. We lived on a farm for a bit. We had, we had cows, we had chooks. I had rats. I've had so many different pets throughout my life. Right now, I've still got a dog, and I absolutely love animals. I'm fascinated with animals as a whole, with what they do and how they are, their patterns, we are very routine based individuals, like humans in general, and so are animals. They have patterns in what they do every day. So my fascination has always been with animals in general. When it came to the hunting front and how I got into that, I guess my dad, when we lived on the farm, my dad shot rabbits and showed us that you could eat wild animals. And that to me was okay, well, that's kind of somewhat fascinating to me. When it eventually got back to down track, I only started hunting when I was 29. I'm now 32. When it came around to it, I didn't have a gun license. And here in Australia, you don't have to get a license to be able to hunt with a bow. So there was just no barrier to entry to go and buy a bow and start hunting. Where I actually live in Queensland, you do have to have access. So we don't have we don't have public land access like you guys do in America and different parts of America. But I've got family that own farm, so I could drive 3.5 hours and start hunting. And they've got red deer on the property where I go. They've also got pigs every once in a while. They've got hares, the big rabbits. They do have some rabbits. And so it was kind of hey, this gives me access to going out and providing for my family in a different way. So it's easy enough to go down to the shop and buy food. And whether I was hunting or not, I would still be a meat eater. But this way, it gives me more of a connection to the food that I'm then eating. So I'm hunting this animal. I have this story and a journey that happens when I'm going after this animal. I kill the animal, not without remorse. There's actually a big process that I'll usually go through after I've actually made a kill on an animal, thanking the body and thanking the soul and thanking the animal in general for what it's about to provide me and my family with. And then from there, I take it home, and every time I go and eat a meal from that animal, I literally get to reminisce on the whole situation. I get to reminisce on the animal, and there's a lot of thought and love that goes in towards the animal. So it's a very interesting process. And I think a lot of people look at hunters as being this very barbaric thing, right? They're just absolute animals in a sense, not in the same form of animals, but they're people that just want to go out and they're bloodthirsty, and that's all it is. But realistically, the way that I hunt and what I always try to do is be as ethical as possible. So it's a very quick and peaceful death for the animal. If you see what happens to the animals in the wild, there's nothing quick and peaceful about it unless they accidentally fall off a cliff. Outside of that, if they're getting hunted by another animal, it's a vicious cycle. It's pretty crazy. I don't know if I shared this, but there's a Instagram page called Nature is Metal, and it's literally animals attacking animals, and it's horrific to watch. It's mortifying what they actually do to each other. And that to me, like seeing an animal in pain, just that actually hurts my heart. And so when I approach it, and whenever I hunt an animal for meat, there is definitely there's a lot of thought that goes into it, and the animal doesn't get wasted. Like either I'm using it or I'm leaving it for nature to utilize. And so there is a lot of love and passion that goes into what I do, but a lot of it's not actually about the hunt. Like the killing side of thing is one big thing, but the adventure and the release and the mindfulness practices that archery and getting out in nature actually gives me is really, really rewarding. And it was something that I didn't realize I was stepping into. And some of my favorite weekends where I've gone out hunting as such, doing it with the inverted commas, I never actually got to see many animals at all. Like I might see them in a far distance and that's kind of it. And I slog my ass off for the whole weekend. Like I worked my absolute ass off. And it's a chance to get gratification without getting it instantly, like we do from the phone and whatever else, right? Like I went and worked my absolute ass off for a whole weekend. And I got to spend all this time in nature, got to see some really cool things. I came home without a reward of meat, but I came home with a full cup. Like mentally, I felt very clear. I was tired, but that I felt like I'd achieved a lot from working my ass off all weekend. And that gratification is something that I think we are very far from right now in the modern world. So yeah, there's a lot to it, and I'm happy to unpack as much as you'd like.
Right. Yeah. It's interesting because to me, like, yeah, I mean, I think it's fair to say that like some, that there are hunters out there who are exactly like what people think, that they're just,
Oh yeah, whack and stack and just do it for the heck.
Right. So it's like, but of course, like there's going to be that variance. And it sounds like to me, like a big part of it is, the connection between your life and the animal in that sense, where it's like, it's not even just about, consuming the meat, but it's also about the recognition of kind of like the path of it all, I guess. Just like how, I don't know, like how people have like a favorite band t-shirt from years ago. Like it's just a shirt, right? But like it's not just a shirt to the person who's wearing it. It's like the significance of what went into it and what is going on, and to not take it again for granted, like you said, where people don't really have that gratitude. And then also just kind of the not disconnect. I guess almost like a return in a sense to like a more natural way of being, I guess you could say, where it's like you're just back where like you might have had to have been years ago. I mean, obviously, cavemen didn't have compound bows, but they also didn't have guns and whatnot. So it's like you have to wait around. You have to understand like just like the value of the patience, or that you don't always get this, or to appreciate what's going on rather than just being bored the whole time. And it feels like there are a lot of little things built into that it just has nothing to do with actually killing the animal. It's more the process in that case.
100%. And like, if I was to shoot with a rifle, I would be very, very successful. Like I would almost every trip I go on, I see deer every time I go out there. So I would almost always walk away with meat, right? But part of the journey was also giving them a fair chance as well, in a sense, right? Like it's a bit more even when I'm doing it in a very almost, I guess, more intuitive way compared to just getting a rifle and shooting from the car and boom, there you go, I've got meat. But yeah, not that that's a bad thing either. I think what a lot of hunters come to is that they don't want to feel disconnected from their food anymore. Like if they're hunting for their families, which a lot of people do, especially I think in America, you guys have a really good system, because if you shoot an animal, you actually have to harvest all of the meat from the animal. You can't just leave a dead carcass there. And whether that goes like I don't know if that's the same in every state, but it depends on the animal, right? Like I'm not talking about like what are the dogs you guys have? I'm just thinking a dingo.
Coyotes, maybe?
Yeah, if you have a coyote, for instance, you would leave that, right? But if it's say, for instance, an elk or a deer, you have to harvest all of the meat from it, and it has to be utilized. You can't just go and dump that meat. So it's being processed. But I guess the point I'm getting at is that right now in the modern way of living, people are very disconnected from food. We go to the shops, we buy food from the shops. There's no extra thought process on where this came from, how it was made, or anything outside of that. Some people are conscious about the ingredients within the food, but there's no real extra process as to, okay, well, this food came from this location. Whereas that's a step now that I think about a lot. And so pretty much almost every meal that we eat, like definitely our lunches and dinners, I at least know where a lot of the food is coming from, or at least all of our protein sources.
Right. Yeah, I guess it's, in a sense, it's kind of like, in a very interesting way, it's like organic, like self-sourced organic food,
Definitely,
you know?
definitely.
And it's
Yeah.
particularly considering, not that I'm an expert on this, but particularly considering the conditions in which like animal meat as we consume it, well, people who consume meat consume it when it's bought through a store of some kind. I mean, it's no secret that the vast majority of that is they're kept in unhealthy conditions, and they're given hormones, they're eating stuff that may not be the best for them, which if you have any understanding of how, like, you know, the consumption of
Factory
nutrients
farming.
works, yeah, they
Yes.
consume that and then we consume them and get that, which is why, as far as I'm aware, like pig is like one of the potentially least healthy things that you can eat, simply because, at least if it's like a farm animal, because they can eat whatever and they'll be fine, but you can eat it and you're going to get everything. So,
Definitely.
which I guess this is completely morbid, but whatever. Like if somebody got rid of a human body by taking it to a pig farm, and then you unknowingly consume the pig, so in a nutrient way, you're kind of a cannibal. So I don't know, just a random connection. You know how it is with me, but I guess the thing that
your mind works in many ways.
there's always a connection to be made, and it's often a kind of crazy one. When it comes to the animal thing, I think that one of the things that always bothered me, whenever I would hear the perspective of like I appreciate the animal and I want to, you know, I use it all and such from a distance, just as a concept. The issue that I generally took with that was, okay, but you also can consume food that, you know, it's probably not going to be the healthiest, but it's already going to be there and it's like already in the stores, and that animal is already dead regardless. But if you go and kill this other animal, like, it didn't have to die in order, you know what I mean? Like, if you eat
Yeah, I
the
get
meat
that,
from
but
the
it's also
store,
like,
yeah.
okay, so does that mean you're going to wipe responsibilities from all things that you've got no control over then? Like, I don't know how to phrase it in a different way, but it's like, the only way we're ever going to see any sort of change within the world is if we start to be the change ourselves, right?
Okay.
So it's like me going and harvesting my own food. For me, that's giving my family the most organic variation of what I can get, rather than going to the store and just hoping that it has been really well looked after. If I stop purchasing meat from the store, it's at least one person in the right direction, right? It's the same sort of situation when people look at maybe like global warming. Like, hey, I'm not going to drive my car because I know that has an impact. So it's like, hey, I'm going to try to buy as little meat as possible from the shops because I want to harvest it for myself from my farm where I've got access to this wild species. But I think another thing to put in the mix here is that these animals are going to die eventually, whether it's because of me or not. They are a pest here in Australia. So they're not a native animal to Australia. So they're counted as a pest. So our government will go and shoot them. They hire helicopters, they hire professional shooters, they fly up in through the mountains, they shoot whatever deer they can, and they leave them there to rot. So in one way or another, whether it's of natural causes or because of the government, at some point this deer is going to die. I would prefer to put that deer to full use within my consumption and my family's consumption and my friends that I get to share the meat with. I would prefer to put it through that way of it, rather than just letting it be of the government causes or whatever else it might be. So it's almost like, I understand exactly what you're saying, but then if I was to sit back and just be passive about it, what does that then show for my actual beliefs, for my actual family? Like what sort of message does that pass on for my daughter? That you should just, even if you believe in something, that you shouldn't ever fight for it, potentially, right? In a very roundabout way.
I mean, it depends. Yeah, it does depend on like how you look at it, because like, again, like where I'm coming from with it is that, like, for example, the animal that's butchered but never eaten, that animal, part of its life in a sense does go to waste. And when people do choose to stop consuming the meat from like the store and to go and get their own elsewhere, in a certain sense, you are making use of an animal's life in a case where it would not necessarily have happened. Like maybe the government would have just killed it, like you said, and it just is there to rot. But then, of course, like there's the reasoning behind that also could expand to anything else. And so, like if, like for example, if someone dropped their wallet on the ground and you found it and you knew who the person was or they had the ID in it or something, the money inside would get spent eventually, of course, but you wouldn't use the same reasoning to take the money out of the wallet before giving it back or whatever. You know what I mean? Just, and I know that it's
Yeah.
like, it's not verbatim, but just to like kind of apply that reasoning to a different situation.
So let's put it in another route then.
Sure.
When we harvest vegetables and fruit and bits and pieces that you often eat, animals get killed in that process, right? Like mice live in the ground. There's bugs that are within that system. Birds come and eat from the trees, and when we knock down those harvest, like when we harvest to get the vegetables, to get all that stuff, bugs and mice and rats and birds and bits and pieces will die during that process. So does that mean that you should no longer eat fruit and vegetables because you are now a part of the picture that is now harming life? So does that mean that because you now know that you should stay away from it?
I guess the thing is that while, because that's kind of a practices thing in the sense of like, absolutely, like if, same thing with, I think it's palm oil, where like the harvesting of that generally comes from a habitat associated with orangutans,
right?
Yeah, and so that can be seen as harming them in that sense. So I think in that case, it's a matter of separating practice from just the reality of something. So, for example, the reality of harvesting a fruit or vegetable, you can do that without expanding, of course, in a certain sense. So I think for me, it's the reason why I think of it to be a little bit differently is that it is not beyond people's ability to find a new means of harvesting plants. So for example, I forget what those are, but like the towers, what they build them up and they harvest them from
I
inside.
agree. There's definitely different ways of doing it. And that's exactly what I see hunting as, right? It's a different way.
Okay.
It's a way of not supporting factory farming as such. Like I do not love that process. I understand it's part of what we need for modern day food consumption. And so it's my way of essentially doing a different way of harvesting vegetables, right? And I do that too. I have got a garden where I grow my own fruit and vegetables and I try to, but I guess it's a part of the holistic approach that I try to take in general is the hunting side of things as well.
So I suppose, like, think of it from the perspective of, because we know that, I mean, you know this better than most as someone who has like a nutritionist background, because like a background in nutrition, put it that way. That while many vegetable and plant, otherwise plant proteins and such are incomplete, there are a handful of like plant proteins that are complete, or like combinations thereof. And so I guess from that perspective, what made you decide to, and I know that it does kind of partially have to do with what you've already talked about, beyond simply the source of protein, but since you want to provide for your family and give them that food, but you also want to be in control of knowing like where it came from and knowing it's not polluted, what made you decide to go that route of hunting versus simply trying to grow a crop of plant proteins that would have like complete protein in there?
Yeah, so I think if you look at what actually has complete proteins in it, there's not a heap, right? I mean, we're talking about, for instance, quinoa is one. And so it's like for us to be able to harvest enough quinoa, I would need to be consuming 6+ cups a day. My wife would be needing to consume 4.5 cups a day. My daughters, like my eldest daughter, would probably need like 2 cups of quinoa a day. And I mean, there's only so much you can do with quinoa, right? Like I'm not going to force feed myself that much, but then to also grow that much quinoa to be able to get some form of complete plant proteins from them, it's going to take a lot more work than what I'm going through right now. But besides that, I'm a meat eater, and I always will be a meat eater. And so in that sense, because I feel my best when I am on plant. When I am on meat, and I eat plants too. And I've tried to go both routes. I've gone completely carnivore. I've gone completely vegan. And I felt much, much better when I was completely carnivore. Right now, I substitute and have other foods as well. It's a mixed, a blended diet, I guess you'd say. But knowing a lot of the science, like, I understand that I'm within the 95% of people that actually thrive really well off of the complete proteins that you would actually get, the complete amino stack that you would get from meat-based animals. There are some people that thrive with just plants, and I'm like, cool, the power to you. Like, I'm all for, I in general am all for do what you want to do, as long as it's not harming other people. Let's go for it. Like, go for it. But within that sense, I've also helped a lot of people who have been vegan and completely depleted. And I've had to come in and have a look at their bloods and say, well, hold up, you're depleted in X, Y, and Z. So we either need to heavily supplement you, and you say vegan, or we start to introduce some meat-based proteins and you'll sort this out very quickly. And a lot of the times when I talk to vegans in general about hunting, they're all for it because it's a nurtured process. And yes, it's still a killing of an animal. It's the extremists that don't necessarily want to see that, but they understand that the way that I'm going about it is like, essentially it's food harvesting in the best way possible. The animal's death, it's very peaceful. It's very calm. It's not like they're being shipped away on a truck and then put into a kill slaughter or whatever. And a lot of the time they're actually all for it. They're actually like, hey, that's very cool. It's very similar in the process to a whole food and a whole, I don't know how I'm trying to say this. Okay. Like it's a nurtured process compared to it just being like a disconnected sort of system. And a lot of people really appreciate that, I think. I think a lot of, and correct me if I'm wrong, but a lot of the belief system is not just about, like, yes, there's the animals and animals as a whole, like, you love animals and that's all part of it. But a big part of it is like the factory farming and essentially the cruelty that happens during that process, right? That's what a lot of people are actually fighting against. It's not necessarily that they're fighting against everyone eating meat as such. And they're more so for the process that I go through versus the process of continuously just buying your meat only from a store-bought process where you do have that disconnect from what you're actually eating.
Yeah, I mean, I can't speak for a community because I've always necessarily been, I mean, obviously first I'm just one person, but I've also never like really been part of like a group in that sense where it's like, I represent this or I represent that. Like, I'm not a Republican, I'm not a Democrat, I'm not like what you would call that, in Australia or like anything else. Like, I'm not part of any given group where that's concerned. But yeah, I think a big part of it is kind of like the notion of the needless consumption of life in that sense, I think is like a big part of it. And I think it does come back to like, and it's the same reason why I didn't become a vegetarian until 2013, is that I was aware, just like you said, it's like, if you stop eating meat, you're still going to keep killing animals because there are billions of other people around the world who are still going to do it. So even if not eating meat was the solution, which I'm not trying to say it is any more than you were trying to say everybody should eat meat. It still would run into the reality that like, what are you going to do? Like, get everybody to do it? Like, even if you understand personally, like the benefits of like cold baths, there's a difference between you applying that in your life and sharing it with the people who are interested. And we can make this like a big thing that everybody's doing. And so the question of it does also become impact, because, like if you say someone's giving you a hard time at a bar or something like that, and you choose to just kind of let it roll off your skin rather than just wiping them out, even if you could get away with it, that also doesn't mean that like, millions of other people aren't going to get killed in like bar brawls around the world, every year or something, whatever it is, So I think, at least for me, the question has always been about impact. And a big reason why I decided not to eat meat anymore is kind of tied into like what you mentioned about like the conditions and practices in, like normal food, where it's like, there's allowed to be like a given percentage, and of course it's going to vary depending on country, but of like feces and meat in the store. And that just grossed me the hell out because it's like, no, I'm not interested in literally eating shit. You know what I mean? Nor do I think anybody else is. So yeah,
What
that was
was
a big
I have not heard that statistic. What was the statistic about feces and meat?
keep in mind that I learned this like a decade ago.
Yeah, got you.
So you know, like some of the details have faded from memory, but I mean, the fact that there is any acceptable percentage of feces in meat, even if it's single digit, to me is like,
Didn't know that that was a thing. Like pretty much,
yeah,
especially here, like meat quality control is ridiculous. And I've actually, for those listening, I run a podcast called Becoming a Bow Hunter. It's all about my journey getting into bow hunting and wanting to learn more to fast track my result as a late onset hunter. And something that I did do was interview a meat specialist here in Australia. And he was talking about like the process that he talked me through was like, it is so strict as to what an animal, what it needs to do. And so pretty much here in Australia, we have biosecurity laws. So I don't know if you have them there in America as well, where from birth, an animal is tracked. So you know exactly what it's gone through, what vaccines it's had, at what times it got sick versus at what times it was well. Literally a complete health record on a health and geographical check on this animal as to where it's been and how it's grown. Then by the time it goes to the abattoir to get slaughtered, they each have their own process that they have to go through, and there's like a very strict rulings that they have to meet, like a criteria that they have to meet for each process for meat for the meat to be. I get it. And so it's like it's actually a very, very strict and very hygienic process. So I would love to actually see the statistics around feces and meat, because I don't think it would be a thing, at least not here in Australia.
Yeah, and of course it's going to be something that's going to vary a lot, you know, depending on the country,
Definitely.
but particularly in America, that's been a thing that's happened multiple times because like, you know, I mean, I imagine it happens to some extent everywhere, but you know, there's where it ultimately will become like a matter of cost effectiveness at some point to the business, right? Because the more care you have to put into anything, generally the more expense is incurred, even if that just means a slower process and by extension less efficiency, which would, you know, reduce in the overall output of meat in that case. And so what you have is that inevitably you will have, you know, workers that will cut corners or will be, you know, unnecessarily like cruel in the process of killing the animal or something like that, and so on. And so I think, I mean, to a certain extent, it's just the nature of things being imperfect, but
Yeah.
also, you know,
But I
it's
think you could
just
also
corruption.
argue like, yeah, I 100% agree with that. We could also argue like a lot of the time, where do bugs and birds and mice poo? Like it's in the fields, right? And that's a lot of the time where you're getting a lot of the vegetables and fruit that you're eating, right? So
Right.
it's like, is there a chance that there's feces on the fruit and veg and bits and pieces that you're eating as well? I'd say if not more of a chance of that being the case, based on the fact that if a bird's flying over a crop, it's going to take its dump wherever it wants to take its dump. And
Right.
if that lands on the cauliflower that you're then buying, the cauliflower only goes through so much processing before it actually comes to you. Like it might be a spray to make sure the pests aren't getting to it. And then if you're lucky, it might get a washover. And then when you get it, depending on how you process it, it might get a washover. I mean, it could be essentially, we could be saying, well, you chose a big part of it, obviously, was the animal care. But then if you heard about the statistic about meat having feces on it, there's a fair chance that all the fruit and veg you've got also has feces on it. So is that going to then make you go, maybe I don't want to eat that fruit and veg?
Right. But as a result of dying, the vegetables don't necessarily release their bowels too. So
Well,
that's,
that's
you
an
know,
interesting fact, because they actually do release their chemicals, right? Which is kind of like releasing their bowels to an extent. They release, depending on which fruit and vegetable you're talking about, they'll release phytochemicals and different chemicals essentially that can be harmful for whoever's going to then eat it, because it's a stress response to make sure that the plant doesn't always get attacked. Like right now, I've got a pawpaw tree out the back, and the possums are attacking it, and they eat it every single night. And I've noticed they've got to a certain point and they've stopped eating it because they've eaten so far into the leaves that the tree's obviously let off its response to say, hey, stop eating me. And the possums are no longer touching it. Which is like, it's the response from the tree or the fruit or the vegetable, because it's all living, right? They all put out a fecal dump or a chemical dump, right? To some extent.
Yeah, but I suppose in that case, it's a matter of the argument of processed food versus, once again, self-harvested food, because then you control what is in it, including pesticides and the quality control or care, whatever, of the processing of the food that you're going to consume. So like if you're doing it yourself, of course, then obviously, like you said, like if you were to harvest quinoa, like there's whatever the expense would be, there's whatever equipment you would need to harvest it. There's all the details that go into that. And I personally like am just, I wouldn't mind growing like a garden of flowers, but when it comes to harvesting things, like that is just, I would rather pay someone who loves being a gardener to do that for me than do that myself, because what matters to me is that it's done properly and so on. I'm not a very experience oriented person when it comes to stuff like that. So, but again, it does come back to the nature of like the processing of it, because how much shit is on your meat because you choose for there to be none.
Exactly.
Right?
Yeah.
So
definitely.
I guess then when it comes to, like, for example, you mentioned that you chose the bow versus a rifle because you want the animal to have some manner of chance. Of course, it's also not really, because I know that like at the end of the day, like you don't want to fully replicate the process of a human trying to throw like a recently sharpened tree limb at the thing, because like you do have a life outside of it. But I guess because you've also mentioned to me before that over time you would like to transition to like a recurve bow or something like that. So I guess like what is the balance for you in terms of like why you come at it a given way? Because of course the animal, it has more of a chance than if you were using like a rifle with a scope,
Yeah,
but
I think
it's not like it can fight you off.
It's part of it, but it's also not the be all end all. Like a lot of it, I think in general in life we've become very soft, right? And I like to do things to challenge myself. And so for instance, I'll like going to the gym is a very important thing to me to make my life harder in a sense, so other things seem easier. So I'll work really hard in the gym, so when I come and sit down at my computer and do my computer work, like it's so easy and it gives me a different perspective. It's the same thing when I go out bow hunting. Like I want it to be tough. I don't want it just to be a walk in the park. I want it to be an experience that I'll remember, and not just driving down the street and see an animal and shoot it. Not that that's a bad thing if you are a time poor person, for instance, but for me, it's like it's an all-encompassing journey. It's not just about the end result as such. And so that's why I choose bow hunting, because it is really hard. And to be honest, the people that I've met in bow hunting since I started like 3 and a bit years ago, some of them are now some of my closest friends, because I go out with them. If I get the chance to go and hunt with them, you quickly learn like it takes a certain type of person to go and do that. It takes a person who's willing to go through hardship, who's willing to put in the grit and the extra miles and whatever else to make it happen. It just seems to weed out whiny, annoying individuals in a sense. So it's like that I've just become very close to the people that I have met through hunting. Yeah, I guess realistically, part of wanting to go back to the recurve is to just take it that next step and make it that little bit more harder. It's once again, it's proving to myself that I don't just want to take the easy route wherever it comes. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, taking the easy route. I think it's actually very smart all the time. But I also want to make myself work harder. And that's just a part of the process, I guess, for me, and a part of the challenge for me.
And it's also ultimately like a balance between everything, because like if you really wanted to like go to the extreme of being realistic, like as other animals have to hunt, like you said before, like the way that many animals die in nature is horrible, but of course that's also because it's much more even, right? Because if a lion can't keep up with, I don't know, a gazelle or whatever, It can't just be
Yeah.
like, well, fuck you. You know what I mean? And just like launch something at it. So
Yeah.
it's like, but of course, like you're also not trying to creep through the brush with a pair of Bowie knives. You know what I
No.
mean? So it's like
And
there's
I think
always going
that
to be
comes
that
down to
balance.
the
Yeah.
ethical side of it, right? Like, yeah, if I was to go out there with just my bare hands, I'm sure I'd eventually get an animal, but at the same time, that wouldn't be a pretty process, and it wouldn't be a process that and it's not that I enjoy killing it all, but it wouldn't be a process that I enjoyed at all. It would be very barbaric compared to what I'm trying to do with the bow and arrow, and be very ethical with the shots that I put, that I do.
Yeah, I guess it is kind of like kind of like a reality of the balance of it, because again, because animals in nature, usually it does go like back and forth, and like say the animal gets away or kills its predator, but then often, times as a result of the fight, it'll just die anyway.
Mm,
Even if it does do that, because like, what is it going to go to a veterinarian, right? So,
exactly right.
um, so in a certain sense, it's almost like if you chose to be so committed to the notion of, okay, well, I want to be as fair to the animal as possible, um, you may, in fact, I mean, obviously, like the percentage of kills you would get would be much lower, because humans only survived at all because we made tools, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Mm-hmm.
but then at the same time, even if you do, like even when you would manage to do it, um, it would be first of all far more dangerous for you, because of
Definitely.
just the realities of it.
Especially some of the antlers and stuff they have, right? Like,
Right. It's just
yeah.
like they're, and like you're not
That's if I
gonna,
was only hunting deer, but yeah.
yeah, and you're not gonna outrun like deer generally. So, um, but then there's also just the reality that, again, that like even when you would make a successful kill, the extent to which the animal would likely have to suffer in the process of that, by the nature of that increased challenge, would be greater than using the bow and arrow. And I suppose that in that sense that like the recurve probably would be like of course it's subjective, but the best cross section of the different factors, because it like
Yeah.
in that case it is all about like you need to
Very primitive. But
yeah
also with
have
the
the
recurve,
strength.
you typically need to be a lot closer to the animal for it to still be just as ethical, right? And that's why so I started off with a recurve bow, and that's why I put it down, because I was like, for me to achieve what I want to achieve, I don't have enough power in this right now. I don't have enough skill in this. So I need to take a step backwards and buy a compound bow and process my way through. And eventually the goal, like we said, is to go back to the recurve. But like, for instance, my first year, it took me 2 years to shoot. Like it was a long process. And that process included me going out for weekends at a time, like every single month. I typically try to get away for a trip. And I would spend the whole weekend just finding the deer, watching the deer, patterning what they do, figuring out where they go in the morning versus where they go in the afternoon, who's hanging out with who at what point and what time. They've got like different breeding seasons. So that the red deer in particular I hunt, they have a mating season, which is pretty much between mid-March to the end of April. It can blow out to. And it's called the rut or the raw, and that's essentially the only time of the year when they mate. And so the girls go into estrus, they get it and go on heat, is what you'd call it for a dog. And the boys' testosterone drops. It's when they've just peeled, so their antlers grow every year. They go into velvet to start with, and they go and scrub them down, and they break them back to just the actual antler. And they're at like their highest testosterone point at that time, and so like it's a very interesting process where they start roaring to say, girls, come and find me, here I am, or boys, get the fuck out of here because they are my girls. And it's just such an interesting process to pattern that, because it's like, okay, well, March through April, you know what they're roughly going to be doing, but the rest of the year you also now need to figure out what they do. So the boys absolutely hate each other during that time, and as soon as the rut is over, the rut or the raw, depending on what you want to call it, those boys go and hang out together and refeed, because they pretty much spend that whole time not eating because they're so focused on mating with as many girls as possible. Then they go out and they all hang out. It's like all the boys at the pub just getting drunk, but they're eating grass and just hanging out. And so it's like, for me, I wouldn't have known all those processes without going and sitting down and watching them for years on end and making it actually happen in that route. And now it comes to where I know my property so well, where I say, you know what, the deer are probably going to be over here right now because of the time of day and the time of year that it is. And the winds are doing this, which means if we walk in, we're not going to see any deer because the wind's going to blow us out and the deer are going to run away anyway. And so there is a lot of like learning and I guess it's a very primitive approach, but there's a lot of learning that I had to do about the animal, and it's given me a relationship with the animals in a weird sense. Like I know so much about these critters and care a lot for them. Like at times, my auntie and uncle who owned the property have said, "You're the only reason that they're actually alive. We would actually kill all of them if it wasn't for you hunting them." They're like, "We know that you like coming out and going as a process and going through the hunting. We like that it gives you some joy, it gives you a chance to get away from the cities, gives you a chance to fill up your cup. We really love that. But if you weren't doing that, we would actually kill them all because they come and steal our cattle's feed. And so we don't like that." So as a farmer, they go, "They are a pest. We don't want them here. We keep them here purely because we understand that there's I guess a journey that I go on with the deer to some extent. And there's not only me that does hunt them. There is my cousin's husband that also does hunt them. So they're like, "Look, we know that that's a part of what you guys enjoy to do and come out here, and we enjoy that you guys come out here to be with us and spend that time." So it's like it's a whole process. But my auntie 1,000 times over has said, "I would kill them if you weren't coming to get them." Like it's a pretty interesting system.
And I guess that kind of gives me kind of the natural segue to focus kind of on like the ethics of like a given hunter perspective on certain other hunters. But first, I want to touch on because you get to know them that way, and you know that obviously like the does, or what I think that's what their name.
Yeah, so depends on the breed of deer, but these are hinds. The red deer that I hunt, they're hinds and stags. Whereas you'll see fallow deer, for instance, are does and bucks.
Okay, so the female
hind,
of the deer species, just to be accurate.
Make it easy, yeah.
Yeah, to be accurate in its generality. Then do you, as a hunter, make a point of not going after them during this time because they could likely be
pregnant? That's a really interesting point. So I actually I signed up to it's like a it's like a research and development group that pretty much research into deer in general, and their whole ethics around it. Because in Australia, essentially, we can hunt all year round. We can hunt every day if we wanted to, because there's that many of them that we could. They reckon it wouldn't make a dent on it. But within saying that, this research and development group have said, look, at times of the year you should not shoot the guys, and at times of the year you should not shoot the girls, because that's what's going to help the populations to increase and keep healthy throughout that time. So if you want to somewhat manage a herd, essentially there's times of the year pretty much from now until pretty much from April until I think it's roughly like end of October, start of November, that you can hunt the girls. But outside of that, you should pretty much not touch them, because they're going to drop the fawns. They're going to be feeding their fawns up. They're going to be growing the new young, versus the guys essentially. And depending on what sort of route you want to go down, but if you're talking about genetics, which is what a lot of what they talk about, you can tell the genetics of a deer based on their antler. And so the way that they grow their antlers, in particular with the red deer, they've got bay, tray, and there's another one. But anyway, so it's the different tines that come off. So you think about their antler being a big stalk, and there's the different tines that come off in different places. And that will show the genetics of a deer. And they're saying, look, based on if you want to keep the herd as healthy as possible, you should be looking for the best genetics to stay within that herd. And so you would base it off of, okay, well, this antler, for instance, doesn't have the different tines that it needs to. It's missing ones, and it's an older deer that's missing these. So therefore that is one that you should get rid of because of the genetics of the deer. You don't want that to spread through and keep breeding bad genetics within the society. But I mean, it's not like, it's like saying, okay, well, we need to get rid of, this is exactly what Hitler did, right? Like, hey, we need to get rid of the Jews because they've got bad genetics. Like essentially that's exactly. If you want to look at it like that, you could get very brutal. But in the sense of, you're looking after the herd and you're growing the herd in I guess in the most positive way possible, then yes, we do look after that to some extent. But yeah, I think once again, it depends on where you are and what sort of ethics you have around that. So some people would just hunt them all year round because it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter to them. They just know that the deer are there and they just want to hunt the deer, and that's all it is. And they know the deer are going to survive because they're probably not going to take numbers enough that would put a huge dent on the population, if that makes sense.
And I guess that does lead me into, like, in terms of the culture of hunters, and of course, like I know that, it's not like you've been doing this for decades or whatever. There's going to be a degree of experience that you have and do not have, and
Yeah.
familiarity with different things. Like it may be different in Australia versus America,
Yeah.
to an extent. But like, is there a given, like, are there certain codes or like beliefs among hunters where, like, particularly related to like where you come from, which is a place of respect and gratitude and such, versus like the perspective of hunters that may come from your perspective on those who are basically just out there for a joyride to be able to kill something and get away with it? Because
I think there's definitely both sides. Definitely, something that actually happened to me early on, because I've talked about I've talked about the whole thing on the podcast, right? Like I've essentially documented my whole journey, from asking people how to become better to becoming a better hunter myself. And at one point I went to a paid property, so I paid to be there to be able to take out some goats. The whole plan was to get there, hunt some goats, get some goats for goat curry and meat ongoing. And I went hunting and I got a few goats, and I actually shot one that I didn't shoot right. And I had a huge ethical battle with that, because I never actually got to recover the animal. And everyone's like, to be honest, dude, that goat is such a hardy creature. It's probably what it would have copped from another goat in a fight, for instance. And I'm like, okay, that was a big ethical battle that I had to go through myself anyway. And what came of that after I released the podcast talking about it, because something else we were talking about during that process was that we weren't sharpening our broadheads as sharp as they probably could have been, because we didn't know how to do it. And so after I launched that podcast and I already was having an ethical battle within myself, I had a few people within the community reach out and say, Matty, you need to be better. Like, if you're going to be doing this as a hunter, you need to make sure that if you're shooting an animal, that the process is, it's a done deal. The same thing with sharpening your broadheads. Like, that is something that needs to be the absolute utmost kept to the importance, because if you're going to have the ability to actually kill an animal, you need to make sure that your tools are in the best possible shape that they can be in. I guess, especially me being in a public light, they were like, for you to go and release content like that, essentially it's putting a bad name on hunting. So you need to be better as an individual, and that's going to help to keep the ethics higher for everyone in general. And that was like a bit of a wake-up call to me. I was like, wow, that was actually very interesting, very insightful, and something that I was very grateful for. At first it kind of kicked a dead horse while it was already down. Sorry to keep on with the death theme, but
it's an expression, so yeah.
Exactly. So yeah, I was already hurting after that whole situation, but it was like, oh fuck, like it hurt so much because he was so right. And so from there, I think it's not only given me a better standard of ethics, but it's also then helped me to portray a better standard of ethics to everyone. I think realistically, most hunters in general, they really try to stand for that. Within saying that, I went to a wedding recently. This is last year at April, so it's not that recent. And one of the guys was a yeehaw type guy, and he told me how, one time we heard of there was deer in the street down the road from us, so we went and we'd had a few tins, so a few drinks. We'd had a few tins, and we went and got the rifles and drove out in the car and shot it, and then just took the head. And I absolutely ripped him a new one. Like, I went off at him. I was like, dude, you are actually the problem with hunting. Like, you as a hunter is what makes hunting have a bad name. And if you keep doing things like that, eventually we're not going to be able to go out and do any form of hunting, and you're going to ruin it. And it's only for your instant gratification of hunting that you're doing that for. So if you keep doing that, your kids are not going to be able to hunt. Your grandkids are not going to be able to hunt. If that's the route you go down, and you have those people, but generations after us, when you start looking after the situation and being smart and ethical about it, otherwise we are going to keep having problems with, for instance, PETA and different people like that are out against hunters. And I think realistically, if everyone took a bit more of an approach like what I tried to do, we wouldn't have those big issues. Like the agreement between us all would be a lot better than you are just whacking and stacking, because essentially they left a whole carcass just out in the middle of the suburban, which is horrible, right? Like, and so right. I think in that situation, it made him go, whoa, actually, you're right. And he didn't really want to talk to me at all anymore, understandably, because I was irate, I was angry about it. And I think realistically, a lot more hunters have my view of it, with the side to that being, if they're a farmer, there's a different process to hunting, right? A lot of the times when they're hunting, it's because it's a pest. So they will whack and stack to an extent, like shoot the animal and leave it to be there. because it's affecting their income. It's affecting what they do. It's affecting the health of their cattle. So for instance, the pigs that enter my aunties and uncles' property, they come in and they rip up masses of land. Like they'll go in, they'll dig for roots and for bulbs and stuff like that to eat. And what that does is it creates holes and craters and bits and pieces, which if a cow steps on, they'll break their leg. Like not always the case, but it has happened. And so for them, they go, well, there's no point in us spending, they do stud cattle. So they'll spend like $100,000 on a bull, for instance, to breed more $100,000 bulls. And so they're like, in that situation, we need to keep our animals and our livelihood as safe as possible. So we're going to make sure that those pigs are not here. So they will shoot them, they'll trap them, they'll do whatever they need to do to get rid of those animals, because they are equipment. Exactly.
Yeah. Like, you know, which if like, you know, say that one of those breaks or whatever, then they're completely out of time or they're, you know, they're basically screwed in that regard, because the time that they spend having to get it fixed or whatever, like I'm no expert on farming, but I do understand that there's a time when you need to do this. And if you miss that because of whatever situation where literally what you use to do this job is not available, then you could maybe lose the crop or lose a lot of the crop or so on. So it does have it's not like it's just like, oh, just shoot the pigs away every time they show up, because what they do cause it's not just a nuisance. It can potentially be like an entire operation threatening kind of situation.
Yes. And so I guess like something that I actually come to a lot when I talk to vegetarians or vegans is that they'll often say, I would eat that meal if you made it for me. I would eat the venison if you cooked it for me, knowing where it has come from and exactly the process of going through it. Would you be in that process? Like, would you go through that and I guess have a meal with friends, for instance, if they came and brought you meat that they had harvested and you knew the whole process of that? Would that be a different story for you as a vegetarian?
For me individually, no. I would not take issue with them in that sense, so long as they were aware that for me, experientially, like my surrounding environment, I never want to be seeing an animal being skinned or processed in any sense of the word.
Definitely.
You know, yeah. So that is not me from an ethical standpoint. It's just me as like, you know, like I never want to be around
Don't
it.
like that.
Definitely. Yeah, or involved in that process. And so for me individually, no. But then again, I'm also a person of extremes. If I could just have a little cube that gave me all the nutrition that I needed, I would just do that.
Take that. Yeah,
because,
definitely.
Yeah. So like, but that is also, of course, an extreme as well, because like I would rather something be cloned in a sustainable way, because I know that there's threats, dangers or whatever of that as well. And then just consume whatever that would be in that case.
Yeah, definitely. Like my sister-in-law, she's a pescatarian mainly, but pretty much is a full swing vegetarian towards completely plant-based, depending on the time of year. She'll have fish and eggs every once in a while, but it's definitely not like a main part of her diet as such. But she comes and stays with us quite a lot, and she's like, Maddie, can you cook me some venison? Like, I would actually enjoy that as a process, knowing everything that you've gone through to do that and how you're providing it in this light, I guess, compared to it being like, if she was out at a store, if she was at a restaurant, for instance, she wouldn't eat that same meal. She'd not go anywhere near it. So it's an interesting thought process, I think, in general, from both sides. And like I said from the start, I'm really all for, hey, do what makes you happy. As long as it's not essentially affecting anyone too much, like as long as you're not getting in prison because of the stuff you're doing to make you happy, then sure, let's go about it. But at the same time, it's like, I like that, for instance, we can come and have this conversation with two opposing views and still be friends, right? Like it's not changed our perspective on either person as such, because we've got differing opinions, but we can still get on in the world and be happy. Whereas I think that's a lot of what the problem is with the world right now. Like, you have a different view and now I hate you. And so it's very interesting. I think I think in general, if more people could have the outlook on things like how we're trying to show and not prove, but just show within this podcast, I think that would in general make the world a better place, right?
Yeah. And I think, and that is ultimately a big part of, I mean, it's in the name, outcast intellectual, because people who do want to think it through and see it from the different perspectives are necessarily outcast because the majority of whatever group generally don't seem to be willing to do that. And I mean, I have my own perspective on that, which is just that most people honestly just are not that high quality of people as I look at it. And so they're not trying to look at it from that full perspective because they're
Definitely.
like that guy that, you know, that you had to ream out basically. They're just thinking, oh, you know what I
Just
mean?
me.
Like,
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah,
They're in
they're
their
just being a bunch of
own circle.
jackasses.
Yeah.
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 And it's the same thing, like, for example, where, for example, like you said in your case, where like you ream the guy out for being irresponsible, but people who would be extremists against hunting in that sense, they don't see that, right? Like, and
Mm.
that's why I asked you like how like your perspectives are on people who are just kind of, you know, thrill seekers. And I guess to kind of hone in on that, and to separate the extremes of it, what are your views on trophy hunting? Because in some cases, like you said, you know, do what makes you happy so long as, you know, don't end up in jail and such. But of course, when it comes to trophy hunting, in some sense, often I imagine it is not very respectful to the animal, and in also many cases, there is the hunting of rare species as well, which is
Mm.
very much flies in the face of what you've kind of gotten at before, where yes, you do kill the animal and eat the animal, but you are making sure that you are not compromising the population because you are showing respect to it.
Yeah, I think one of the first things we need to clarify is what is trophy hunting? What are you classifying as trophy hunting?
Right. So yeah, because I mean, I imagine, for example, in your case, like say that like you harvested the rest of the animal and then you mounted the head or whatever. Personally, I'm always gonna find that fucked up anyway, because to me that's like, I understand it's like to someone like it's a sign of achievement, but to me it's like, well, you know, it was still a creature. In that case, you're not really in my mind celebrating what it gave you, and it's more just kind of celebrating the kill. But I guess for the sake of just giving you an extreme to focus on,
Mm.
um, just think of the people who will literally like they go and kill like a lion or a
Yeah.
rhinoceros or something, and they're literally just harvesting the thing that they want to show, and that's it.
Yeah. And so I think in this case, and I've been really well educated. Like I've been better educated because of the stuff that I've done. And I've come to realize that a lot of that is around conservation, right? And so if that situation was not in place where someone could essentially go and pay to go and hunt a lion, even though I don't necessarily feel like that's a great thing to do. Like it's not something I would go and personally do myself. I understand that the money that's put into that is then what helps an operation like that to keep, for instance, a population potentially a lot healthier than what it would have been prior. So I don't know how much you know about Africa, for instance, but a lot of the hunting that gets done is completely in high fence situations where essentially an outfitter or a farmer has gone ahead and put up a high fence situation so they can breed the animals and get a healthier number of the animals within the system. Because prior to that, the locals, literally everyone who lives there, would just hunt them, and many of them were near complete extinction. So what happened is these outfitters started high fencing the areas, somewhat controlling the animals by making sure that they weren't getting hunted every single day or poached every single day by the locals. They gave money to the locals to start fending off and protecting the animals. So they're giving jobs within the place. And essentially what happens when a hunter comes, they'll pay $250,000, for instance. I think US is roughly what a lion would go for. At least that's what I've heard. And that $250,000 then goes back into the conservation of the rest of the lion herd. So making sure that the rest of the lions are safe, they're being protected by the humans from the humans. They're in a situation where they're free to roam within a high fence situation. We're talking about like 1,000,000 acres or something. Like it's a huge space, a huge plot of land that has a high fence around the outside of it, where they're free to roam within that space. So it's kind of like a safari in a sense, where they essentially let people go and hunt. And so my understanding is that through doing things like this conservation work, essentially they've been able to bring numbers up compared to dropping the numbers down. So in a situation like that, where you go and shoot a lion, Although once again, I don't necessarily agree with it. What we're seeing with that situation is that the population is there and now thriving compared to what would have now been a dead population if it was not for what hunters have done and what they have put in place with the full conservation, which seems like a very backwards sort of theory, right? But that's exactly what they're doing in America, for instance. You guys have a really good situation with that, where you have to buy tickets, and the money, a ticket is essentially, my understanding, is your pass to then go and hunt that animal. And like 30% of tickets get sold. Sorry, 30% of tickets get filled each year. So they're essentially saying, okay, to go and hunt elk this year, you have to buy a ticket. 10,000 people buy elks, and maybe 3,000 of them will shoot elk, which means the other 7,000 people's money, we're then going to put back into making nature better by intervening and putting things in place to make sure that these elk can continue to thrive. It's the same sort of situation that they've done in Africa. So although I'm not necessarily, like, I wouldn't go and shoot a lion myself, I understand why it's in place. I understand that there is actually somewhat of a space for that, because if anything, hunters have, like I said before, hunters can be hunters' worst enemies, but hunters are also nature's best friend in that sense, where the outlook of it is that they're actually willing to do a lot and pay a lot to make sure that areas are preserved rather than them being desolate, which might seem backwards. And yeah, I'd love to hear your thoughts on that. And I'm by no means an expert on that, but my understanding is that a lot of the animal races within Africa have been saved because of what hunters and outfitters have done, versus the opposite, where they would have been a lot more extinct right now if it wasn't for that sort of situation when they came in and implemented what they essentially did.
Yeah, I think in this case, the way I look at it is separating it as the operation of conservation, which is funded by hunters, so as to continue that operation of sorry, what is it again? I don't know. I keep losing the word. Conservation. I don't know.
Yeah.
And so in that essence, the money of the hunters is the value, ultimately, not the hunters themselves. But of course, like, the money has to come from somewhere, right? But I think for me, it's important to separate the conservation from the action of the hunter itself in that case, because theoretically, okay, the money is what enables the conservation in that case. It's not the hunting itself, but it's the demand, of the hunter to do it, so they'll pay for, etc.
Yeah.
And so theoretically, the conservation could be paid for via means whereby the animals would not be killed at all.
Yeah, it could be paid for by vegans, right? But
right.
It's not.
Right.
So I understand it.
Yeah. So that's.
No, sorry, I just wanted to put that in, but keep going.
Yeah. So, and then again, like, I think that is one element. And then there's also the nature of the person who is choosing to pay to kill it. And one could say that, maybe part of it for them is wanting to support that conservation. But of course, that's also an assumption. And like, one is not going to know if that's, viable in that case. So for me, it's kind of like, because ultimately there is no value then in the trophy hunting as an act, but more so as an act of commerce, whereby that money is paid to hunt the animal and it's paid to the conservation so that's continued. So in that case, the way that I would look at it is that, and of course, this would just be theoretical, is that it would be preferable that would just be funded in that case versus whatever. And of course, I know that there's the realism element to it.
I think even if we were to defund the world, right? Like, even if money didn't have a value, it's still a food source then potentially for those people over there, and so it's still going to be of value to them. And so they won't necessarily stop, and maybe the protectors then become the hunters of the animal in that situation, where they've now got meat, which is then their currency to be able to use instead. And I essentially think that the currency that was brought in by money to protect these animals is partially, and it's like you said, it's commercing these animals, but essentially it's what also saved them.
Well, that's what I mean, though. Like, say that it was paid for without the hunters being involved. Say that the government paid for it or whatever. Like, because in that case, they would still have the money to pay the locals and such. Like,
Mhm.
if that were viable, would you still think that that would be preferable to the situation that's going on?
Yeah, I mean, I think until we see
Theoretically, of
something like
course.
that, yeah, I mean, theoretically, like, unfortunately, that's not what happens. And so
Right.
it's like,
Yeah.
hey,
That's
right
fine.
now, I think this is the best situation, as horrible as it might be to say, but this is the best situation for actually the health of the populations that we actually are seeing right now. Because outside of that, we would have literally seen extinction on a lot more animals. And like I said, I'm no expert on this. Someone who is actually really good at this and talks a lot. With different actual biologists and now I'm losing it. Like
Conservation. Yeah.
would it be conservation?
Oh,
Like what's a person who does conservation? I don't know.
conservationist, I
Conserve.
guess. I don't. Yeah.
Yeah,
Like,
like
yeah.
so essentially someone who has a conversation with a lot of those people is a guy called Robbie. I can't remember his last name, but his podcast and his brand and what he's trying to do is called Blood Origins. And he talks a lot with outfitters in America, outfitters in Africa. He talks a lot with vegans and vegetarians and has these sorts of conversations and talks it out about, like, yes, exactly the same sort of conversations we're having. But yeah, that's definitely, if someone wants to look further into what I've talked about and actually hear statistics and numbers and yeah, I guess the proof behind what I've actually just said, then Blood Origins is a place to go and check that out for sure.
Right. So I guess you see it as like the lesser of two evils in the sense of that it provides the ability for the conservation to be ongoing, but like
Definitely.
at least like theoretically you would at least, like, if there was just all this money to be put into it, you would still see just directly funding the conservation without the hunting being necessary. Would you still see that as superior in that case?
Yeah, and I think once again, like I would probably not back trophy hunting as much, depending on what you call trophy hunting. Once again, or define as trophy hunting, but I probably wouldn't think there was much of a reason for it.
If they were viable, like, I know it's,
If it was viable, exactly, and that's a different world. I think another way to look at this is, I'm pretty sure it's in Yellowstone right now. They've put a whole heap of wolves in there, and the wolves are now killing off all of the other species because they've got no other predators that can essentially take them down. Like, I'm pretty sure the mountain lions that you guys have don't necessarily, like, they get overpowered by the wolves.
mhm.
So the wolves have been put in to restore the population of wolves, and now what they've done is they've started taking out other herds of animals, to, like, where they've completely driven them from areas. And so in that situation, what they would say is that now it's a hunter's role to come in and potentially take care of some of the wolves to bring back healthy populations of the other animals. And so in that sense, it's like, how do you look at that? So if essentially you don't bring hunters in, eventually they hunt out the wolves hunt out every other species, and it just becomes a wolf eating wolf situation, or eventually they all die, or they feast off into somewhere else. Like, what's your outlook on that in that sort of situation?
Yeah, my perspective on that is that human beings, on average, discount their negative impact on the world to such a
Hmm.
degree that they look at it like it's this objective thing that has nothing to do with what they're doing. But for
Hmm.
example, the reason why I would be willing to bet, even though I don't, have a friggin' PhD on it, that many of the species that we are aware of being close to extinction are as such because of human hunting,
Hmm.
more or
I,
less. And
I
so,
wouldn't put it
and
down to human hunting. I'd put it down to humans in general.
the
Like, we go
human,
and
you
take
know what I
over a
mean?
whole situation, right? Like, we
Yeah,
go and build
human
a city.
intervention.
We kill,
Right.
right? Like, that's
Humans.
essentially what happens. So yeah,
Yeah.
I wouldn't put it to hunting as such. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I mean, just in the sense of like the human being the one that causes the death of animal that
Yeah.
becomes
Okay.
extinct. Yeah. And so the way that I look at it is like, it's easy for people to say it's like, oh, like the wolves are getting, like, the wolf population is getting too big for the other animals. But that's because we had this condensed environment. And I know it's like, oh, it's like, there's X number of acres, whatever. But in reality, it is still condensed compared to what would normally be just the habitat of the world,
Mm.
where the wolves would not be encased in a given space,
Yeah,
whatever it
definitely.
is, and they could naturally migrate, or whatever it is, that a wolf would, wolf pack would be considered to do. And so I think that people are looking at it from this perspective of, yet we are essentially helping the overall animal population by hunting these wolves in this case, but people were also the ones that created that situation to begin with by it not being safe for these animals to be across the rest of the wilderness without people being able to kill them, according to like general rules. So my
Definitely.
general response is just that humans ultimately create the overarching situation whereby this could even be an issue.
But because we've created that situation, what is then the response? Like what is your outlook on it? So essentially, we've created the situation and put them all into this one space. And right now the wolves are hunting everything within that one space. And
Mhm.
eventually, if we don't do some sort of intervention, the wolves are going to literally decimate everything. So what is the situation? What is what sort of outlook do you have on how do we actually deal with that then outside of intervening, because we've already intervened and put them into a situation where they can't necessarily thrive like you're talking about? So what is the next step? Do we just let the wolves kill the wolves? Sorry, the wolves kill all the animals and then eventually the wolves kill the wolves? Or do we somewhat manage that system and manage that population to make sure that everything within that ecosystem that we've created can still survive and can still live and somewhat have a natural form of life, without one species overruling the others?
Right. So, of course, that's just as like you said, like,
The
in a
same with the
world,
game hunting, right?
yeah,
Exactly.
well,
Yeah.
yeah, in a world where you could just fund all conservation with the magical pile of money that would just be generated to do it,
Mhm.
and by extension, trophy hunting, as I've just at least as I've talked about it in this
Yeah.
particular case, would, as from your perspective, not, there would be no real sense in doing it in that particular context. There's going to be the different elements of like ideal world versus real world situation. And so,
Mhm.
in this situation where, for example, you have no budget whatsoever, um, yeah, the hunters going in and killing, the wolves to a given degree or whatever could be seen as a viable solution. The way that I guess I would try to balance ideal versus reality would be to try to go in there and sedate given packs of wolves and then transplant them to another sanctuary or something like that
Mhm.
or whatever. So in that sense, you know you remove them or reduce the overall issue. And yes, they could be, even if they were just put in another habitat that's viable to them where they could be hunted. In that sense, at least the hunting would be maybe not as likely or whatever, just because it's like a much larger expanse. So that would be kind of like me trying to balance it, is that do
Mm.
not go in and hunt them, but to go in and extract them and move them elsewhere. Because if they are like generally endangered species, then put them somewhere else where they could potentially grow elsewhere and where their propagation would not be as much of an issue because it would be over a larger space would
Yeah,
be my
I think
attempt to
I
do
think
this.
essentially that is what they have done to some extent. But now it's like, so they've moved the wolves from one place to another place. They've done the same thing in that place, and so they keep doing that where they move them to a new place every single time, and then the wolves keep doing that. Um,
Well, I mean, outside of
like I
Yellowstone.
said, exactly. And so it's like essentially if they're then going ahead and overruling populations every single place they go without some form of human intervention because of the situations, the ecosystems we've put them into, at what point do you intervene and what point do you not? And I guess that's where scientists are really, that's where they have their numbers that they try to hit each year. And
Yeah,
where
but
the
I think it's also unrealistic for people to look at it as like we've run out of places to put them, because I think that
oh,
that would,
100%.
yeah, I mean, like there's absolutely more space to put the wolves and stuff like that in that sense. And I think it largely people's arguments for that would be more based on budget than anything else, which ultimately shows that a lot of this element of hunting, as much as people might try to, in some cases, I'm not going to say glorify it, because like in an individual level, it can be in that element of gratitude and such. But as a culture, is that people only value animal lives generally insofar as convenience goes. And that goes for
Mm-hmm.
people as well, which like I know is not really, like what we came in to talk about, but it does really show to me that it's like, people are all about it's like, oh, like, appreciate animal life or whatever until it's coming after their farm. or until it's in their neighborhood or whatever, just as they're all about, giving people second chances, except for when that ex-con is living 3 houses down. You know what I mean? And
Yeah,
so
exactly.
it just goes to show that in large part, and this is another reason I don't have a high opinion of people, but individuals, is that people's integrity generally only goes as far as their convenience. And
Yeah,
so,
definitely. Yeah, and so I guess like it's a great conversation, and I think it's one that needs to keep being had, because it's like, so in that circumstance, so Colorado I think is the part in Yellowstone where they've put the wolves in to thrive, and let's say another state, and I don't know all your states necessarily, but let's say another state, Louisiana, says, you know what, we don't want wolves here because we're worried about our people are being attacked, so we're not going to bring them into our population because we're happy, like everyone's living well right now. Does that then make Louisiana a part of the problem? Like, are they then just as bad in your eyes as the hunter for not looking after the animal as such, and not giving them a new place to populate as such, compared
right.
to controlling the species?
Well, to kind of preface that, I mean, it does depend on how familiar the wolves were with human interaction to begin with. Because as I'm sure you're aware, many animals, but predators included, generally avoid humans. And probably because, it's scary, and like, you have the trucks or whatever it is. And so to a certain extent, I believe that those fears could be largely unfounded, in the sense that it's not like you're going to have, this big Hollywood CGI army of wolves, running into New Orleans to just, devour,
The wolves
like
of New Orleans.
Day of the Wolf,
Yeah.
Battleground, New Orleans. You know what I mean? So
We are wolves.
exactly. B movie.
Yeah.
If people still had video stores, it'd be on like the bottom shelf. But I think so. That's my first perspective on this. That I think it would be kind of an extreme view on it, possibly. But also, it makes me think, and I know that originally, like the point of this was to look at people's perspective on hunting. By the way, how much more time do you have? Because I do want to be considerate, but also like, not
Yeah, I
cut it
think
off.
we can go for like another 5-10 minutes or so. Definitely.
Okay. So
Yeah.
for me, then, I guess, to bring this back, because I feel like we kind of touched on all the different elements to one extent or another, as we can, or many elements, to bring it back
Definitely.
maybe holistically, because like you joked earlier, the genetics of the Jews, whatever. So to connect the notion of conservation and their lives are worth something until it's an inconvenience, or depending on our perspective on them, and gratitude, and dehumanizing or devaluing the life of it. Even the Nazis originally just tried to export Jews to different countries. And eventually those countries just said, well, stop sending them here. Of course, we know what the Nazis did after that, which is also kind of ties into what you mentioned about, well, like if the population gets unruly of wolves, of course, like we're talking about very different situations, in the sense of wolves tearing out the throats of animals versus Jews just being people, you know what I mean?
Definitely.
But
yeah.
It does go back to the thing of how that common notion of, oh, there's too many of this problem. There's only this final solution. And so in that case, like people's reduction of the value of life in that case, I think goes to show a lot that like they just see it, like you said about the general view on deer in Australia as a pest. How do we kind of bridge the gap between you're just a food source, you're lesser than us, and where you come from, from what I perceive, which is the element of gratitude, and to value the life arguably more than the person who consumes the meat at the market that does not come from the wild, because at least you had to struggle, and at least you had your process and such. So I guess it's more just me kind of mentioning this off of your
definitely.
question, and like, what do you think? Like the connection.
I think it's like, obviously we're dealing with it in the way of cohabitation right now, and we need to figure out something. And right now, essentially, hunters came to the party and did actually figure out a solution. And it might not be the best solution for everyone. They might not think it's the best solution, but for now, it's actually seen healthier numbers of populations throughout the world because of what they have implemented. So in my eyes, they've only done a positive thing, even if that came with taking some lives. And so in that sense, it's like, I think lives are valuable, obviously, like the animal lives in particular, very, very valuable. But at the same time, we do have a circle of life and we are living together. And there is always been a process of essentially humans, it's either kill or be killed to some extent. And that might be a bit extreme, but I'm also not for going and creating cricket farms and living off of quinoa for the rest of our lives, because I don't think that is actually going to populate and make healthy individuals. Like, we're only seeing a sicker world as it is in general. And so for me to keep living the healthiest, happy life for myself and my family, this is the way that I kind of start to see, okay, well, this is my way that I can make an impact, at least on my inner bubble. And hunting in general, I think, although it might not be the best solution, it's definitely a solution that's working right now. So it's like, hey, if there is to be other situations or other solutions, then start bringing them to the party and let's actually start to work towards that. And I think realistically, a lot of hunters want the best for the populations. Like, a lot of them are genuinely coming from it from the same sort of perspective I am, but then they also like to consume meat that they've harvested themselves. So I think realistically, in a sense, we both kind of want the same thing. It's just that we go about it in different ways of doing it.
Yeah, I think the issue to me largely then is that the elephant in the room, so to speak, is that it is the human population's requirement of given resources, which is ultimately the issue. Because I mean, it's difficult to argue that humans are not, if you look at it as our impact on the planet, overpopulated, drastically overpopulated.
Exactly. And so what do? Do you kill the humans? Like,
right. Well, in that case, well, in that
case,
yeah, like there's the consideration of, for example, like you have like Musk, who wants people to go to Mars and stuff like that. So like in that case, like you would, it'd be like a form of migration in that sense. So in that case, to use the wolf example, to remove the wolves from that area so that they couldn't have as big of an impact on the resources, animals, and so on around them. Because at the end of the day, like, people like to act like we're special, but we're just another animal with an evolution. Well, we're an evolution that our brains allowed us to drastically outscale everything else in every way. And so eventually people, I think, need to have the objective reasoning to understand that you need to deal with people the same way that you would deal with population of anything else in the world, because we do affect everything else in the world, and you cannot just have more people and have more people and have more people and just have respect for what you're consuming, because eventually it gets to the point where people need so much that we're just going to make everything barren. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Yeah. And so in a sense, it's like, it's a bit far-fetched, but in a sense, it's like you're agreeing with what we're doing without agreeing with it, right? Like, yes, we need to deal with the situation, and yes, hunters are dealing with it, but it's also not the way that you want to deal with it.
And I think it's the balance ultimately, like what you said, where it's like, okay, great, if there's a big gigantic pile of money that just goes to any conservation effort, then yeah, no trophy hunting. But this isn't the case. So what is our viable reality? And so for me, yeah, it's kind of like the question of, it's the balance between the idealistic world where like we don't need to eat anything and could just use 0 point energy to consume, you know what I mean? Like, where like nothing gets,
like, where it's never ever going to happen, but it would be great.
Right. Well, I mean, give it a few million years if we last that long, but yeah. And then also just kind of like, what is the most reasonable balance of all factors, I think, is ultimately what it comes down to, because it's not really fair to me ever to mow down herds of anything with people in helicopters and machine guns. Like, when it comes to that, my attitude is fuck the farmers, because the farmers can always move. And yeah, their life will be hard, but not nearly as hard as something that literally you're just eating a patch of grass and then something in a fucking helicopter mows you down with an automatic weapon. And I know that's an extreme. I know that, again.
Yeah. So I guess you could put that on a different spin then. It's like, okay, so your house gets invaded by rats. You have a complete rat infestation in your house. So many rats that when you sleep, they come and eat you. They come and bite at you. So you can't sleep there. So you now have to move. Is that the right situation then? Or do you deal with the rats?
Right. Well, I think in that case, I mean, again, just as my example was extreme, your example is also extreme because
extreme. Exactly.
Yeah. So it's like
I guess a lot of the disconnect comes from people look at farmers as if they've just got it in a very different way to what they actually have it. Like here in Australia in particular, they get told which trees they can deal with. Like they'll have a field full of trees and they're not allowed to touch them because we've taken too many trees to make the cities happen, that we need to have trees out in the bush to make sure that we've got enough oxygen here. And that's the reasoning to it. So you now on your property have to do what we say because of what we did in this location over here instead. And essentially it's the same sort of perspective then of, well, you just have to move because your farm's now infested with pigs that are going to make it a desolate country unless you do something with it. So
I have a two-part kind of response to that because I don't want to sidestep your question. So the first thing, just to address the general notion of it before bringing it back to the specific element, is that the problem then is the human consumption of the trees. And so it is, if the humans want to act like they're so much better than all the other species and we're considering all these different factors and whatever, then people need to get off their fucking asses and stop focusing on iPhones and better homes and solar generators or whatever, and focus on their impact on the planet in that regard. Not in the sense of, you just make everybody go and like kill themselves so we can plant more trees, but to just have a holistic attitude towards our involvement with the planet as a whole, because just make more fucking trees. We have the entire network, like entire global network. And I know that you can't bring trees from everywhere and put them in whatever, but like people can make it happen. So that's the general response that I have to that element. But for like the rat situation, say that you were in that situation, it ultimately comes back to, I think, two things. One, the reality that human lives these days, for the vast majority of the time, our low quality of life is so ridiculously higher than not just animals, but just 60 years ago or whatever, or well, 100 years ago at this point. But you know what I mean? Like that, like I don't have as much sympathy for people having to move in that case, because even if for them their lives are completely uprooted, their bare minimum, they're starting from zero, is nowhere close to an animal having to actually start from zero in the wild. And on the other extreme, it depends on how much the person values the life of that animal. And I actually kind of did an episode on this a few weeks ago. It's like what you value, where the other side is coming from, and your value of the balance. And so in this case, I would say it depends on someone's perception of the value of life of the rats versus the extent of the inconvenience on their lives, and then kind of the balance of all the different factors there. Because
but therefore, like, is there a hierarchy in regards to animals? So you might see that it's all right to go and get rid of the rats, but in the sense that they can't go and then get rid of the deer or the pigs. Like is that essentially what you're saying?
What I'm saying is that it's contextual, and so it would be up to each individual.
So there is a hierarchy.
I don't believe there's a hierarchy simply because that is entirely up to somebody's personality. Like a human life stops being valuable to you if they're trying to kill your family. And so there is no ultimate hierarchy. I mean, I am on the extreme of I don't believe any life has value, because why would it? Like it's again, it's a whole cycle, right? If our planet got hit by a meteor, it's not like the galaxy would implode. But for me, as an experience, again, for me, for example, a dog's life would be more valuable than a person who was abusing it. And so if that person was going to kill that dog for whatever, like assuming the dog isn't trying to kill the person, I would have a much easier time just killing that person to prevent the dog from dying in a vacuum. Again, this is not me stating something in intentive purpose.
Definitely.
But that's also why I think that ultimately it's an existential answer that I want to give, is that the rat's life does not have an inherent form of value, nor does the deer, nor does the humans. It's all up to the human as a conscious creature to decide what it values most and above all, what balance it values most. Because say that they just don't have the money to kill all the damn rats. You know what I mean? If
Exactly. Yeah.
there's literally thousands, so it's like, again, it's going to be contextual. So it's, I don't mean
And
to
I think
give
in
a
the same
cop out
sense,
answer.
like, no, definitely. I think in the sense, like when you look at it that way, humans have put themselves as a hierarchy and everything else comes below them. Essentially, that is the way that we live, right? Because we
Most
go
people,
and
yeah.
we well, everyone, if you like it or not, we've gone and built cities that you're now a part of that took away from something else. So therefore, you're saying that you were bigger and better than whatever else was there before by simply living and simply being a part of that. So
I don't agree with that actually.
so it's essentially what you just said, though, right? Like a farmer has to move if the pig population is too big, and it's overrunning their situation. Whereas now the animals have had to move because we've now gone and populated a situation, a city, and so the animals then had to move on. So therefore, they are the hierarchy of that situation. Is that not right?
I don't agree in the sense that me being involved in a general sense in means implicit, specific, um, not acknowledgement, support of given practices. Like you could say, okay, like I live in an apartment building which originally belonged to one person, and then somebody else basically screwed them out of the deal and like, bought the apartment buildings for an amount where the person who originally owned it lived as a hobo for the rest of their lives. And by living in this apartment building, now I'm supporting the act of screwing people out of money
I agree on
because
that,
you know what I
definitely.
mean.
But this is a
So
different perspective. It's like we're talking about the actual situation of the living quarters. So it's like by you living in the place that you're living in, at some point humans had to harvest and change that whole environment, right? That once once belonged to the animals that live there. So it is a very different outlook on that compared to that situation. Yeah, where I would agree that is very different. Like the voice that, sorry, what you just said, I agree with you 100%, but I think it's also different to the situation. Whereas humans, we are consumers and we consume the world in general. And so what that means is that essentially we all take a part in what has now become of the creature civilization, which is exactly what you're saying before with us putting them in ecosystems, right?
yeah, I think for me, it once again comes down to individual choice because, for example, like you said, people developed this area and everything that entailed in that. Um, but then, of course, like for example, there are rabbits around my property.
Hmm.
If somebody else decided that they want to get rid of the rabbits because they might eat the flowers, that does not make me complicit in the act of killing the rabbits because somebody
Agreed.
else decided to do that. So it's, and again, I mean, like we're trying to present concepts, which
Yeah.
by nature, cannot necessarily address all nuances. But I do agree with the essence of what you mean, which is that, okay, it's fine to talk about the nature of, people need to be more holistic about that. But then what is your individual part going to be in that? Like, how are you going to not just be a taker? How are you going to be thinking about it as a holistic member of the planet rather than just a selfish creature that wants and takes? And I guess it
Yeah.
kind of brings us full circle because,
I was going to say, I think it's what we're both trying to do in our own ways, right?
yeah, and that's where your
Yeah.
hunting came from, is ultimately
Yeah.
to, to value it and to make your choice of I'm not going to just be a mindless taker who's, going to be implicit in those other things too.
Yeah, definitely.
So
Well,
yeah,
this has been cool. I've enjoyed the conversation a lot, to be honest.
me too.
Yeah, and I hope if whoever's listening along is also feeling the same, right? I think if anything, it just makes you think. It opens up your mind to, okay, well, hold up. There's a whole nother side to it, and there's always the way, right?
Right. And it also comes back to just the willingness of the different parties to work to understand the essence of something rather than say, well, this is why you're just a serial killer using killing another species as a way to like enable being a serial, you know what I mean? Like, or the other way around, it's like,
Definitely.
oh, well, so for people's attitude to come from that higher place of like having the conversations and thinking about the things about like the implicit nature of it, because as you demonstrated, is that this is not as simple as kill animals bad, eat vegetables good, be a good person. You know what I mean? And
Yeah.
I've always been like I'm not religious in any sense, but I would rather be around like our buddy Lauren, who is very religious because he's a good person,
Mm-hmm.
right? Rather
Exactly.
than someone who believes what I believe, but is an asshole. And I think
Mm.
that is where the attitude needs to come from in this podcast, of course, but then also with people in general, because I don't want to just look at someone who's a hunter as a prick simply
Definitely.
because of whatever, which is why we need to have these conversations because otherwise we just have preconceived notions, right?
Yeah, 100%, dude.
Cool. Well, then I guess because I mean, this is live right now, but of course you never know who's going to be seeing what when. So I'm going to do the thing. If people want to see more of you or experience, more of the Matty Turner experience, where can they do that?
I think the best places to follow along is on Instagram. My Instagram page is becomingabowhunter.podcast, or you can just obviously search the podcast at Becoming a Bow Hunter, and that can be found on all platforms essentially. And then my own Instagram handle is Matty After, if anyone wants to follow that at all.
Cool. And you have an email list as well, so people can also sign up for that.
Yeah, currently giving away a knife. If anyone wants to get involved with that, you can go to just www.becomingabowhunter.com and you'll find the draw for that straight away.
Cool. And I'm sure that, as time goes on and the podcast gets even bigger, maybe whenever somebody sees that, who knows what you'll be giving away. Maybe it'll be the knife and something else, or maybe it'll be a machete or whatever. You won't know unless you check them out.
A bigger knife. That's not a knife. This is a knife.
What a perfect way to end it with an Australian stereotype. Cool.
So
well,
played knifey spoony before.
Who knows? Maybe someday that'll be the giveaway, dude.
Exactly.
And yes, go. Bye.
Thanks, dude.